welcome to a Hughes Center conversation on renewable energy efforts in New Jersey with a focus on wind energy in particular. My name is Alyssa Maurice. I'm the Research Associate at the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy at Stockton University. I'm joined today by Stockton professor Dr. Patrick Hossay to dive into this topic. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Can you start us off by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Professor Patrick Hossay. I'm the founding chair of sustainability and professor of sustainability and energy science at Stockton.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us. I want to zoom out and just start at the beginning. So what is the goal of decarbonization and what role does renewable energy play in that effort?
Right. So basically, decarbonization is a term meant to signify that we need to reduce the amount of carbon we're adding to the atmosphere. Basically, carbon is an element that's constantly recycled in our ecosystem. So it's in our air, it's in trees, it's in plant, it's in all of us. Anything that's organic, that's living, has carbon in it. But what's happened is we've dug up very, very, very old living carbon from, say, swamps hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we're burning it in the form of fossil fuels. That's adding this old carbon into the atmosphere and fundamentally changing then the thermodynamics of the climate. That's where we're getting what we call global warming, but probably more correctly, climatic change, because as we've already noticed, in some places it's more warming, in some places it's more wet, in some places it's severe storms, in some places it's more wildfires, etc. So we're having this fundamental and very, very fast change as a result of adding all this very old carbon into the atmosphere, and therefore kind of changing the whole carbon cycle that the Earth depends on. The idea of renewables is to find forms of energy generation, electricity generation, that don't put carbon in the atmosphere, or at least put a lot less carbon in the atmosphere, so we can mitigate against this catastrophic effect. So things like wind, solar, maybe even possibly hydro energy, and other forms basically don't rely on fossil fuels and therefore don't make the disruption of our climatic system worse.
Now, focusing on wind energy specifically, can you give us a rough idea of the mechanics behind offshore wind energy? For those who are completely unfamiliar, how does it work?
Right. And usually the sense that people have is that wind energy is like the wind beating against the blades of a turbine and getting them to spin. But in fact, those blades on a wind turbine are generating lift. And that's a very well understood dynamic in physics, because it's the way aircraft and helicopter and other things fly as well. They generate lift. And that's a very efficient way to generate a rotational force from wind. So wind turbines are actually extremely efficient and extremely effective. We're basically putting blades like aircraft wings into the wind. That creates lift, that spins a turbine, that generates electricity. It's just that simple. But one thing that's worth noting is, just like an airplane, we need very smooth, predictable airflow. So for example, when an airplane hits turbulence, when it hits erratic wind, what we call turbulent wind, it tends to lose lift, and you get that bump that you don't like when you're flying, in a plane. Well, wind turbines also can be very inefficient, and it can be problematic when they get irregular winds. So one of the nice things about offshore wind turbines is they're exposed to very smooth, predictable, what we call laminar, so non-turbulent flow of air, and that means they can generate lift much more effectively and are much more reliable.
Thank you for that explanation. I know it's tough to conceptualize how these things work. And another thing that's sort of tough to conceive of is how big they are. Can you give us a sense of the scale of these turbines?
Right. Yeah. And so, okay, in non-technical terms, they are huge. We've moved actually to larger turbines. So some folks that are listening might be familiar with the turbines, say, outside of Atlantic City, which are 1.5 megawatt. But a typical offshore wind turbine is well over twice that capacity. So right now we're putting in offshore wind turbines, or we have offshore wind turbines around the world that are generating about 2.5 to 3 megawatts of energy, or basically about twice the capacity of the turbines outside Atlantic City. However, newer wind turbines are significantly larger than that, and we're moving toward wind turbines that might generate 20 megawatts. Now, I know the listeners might not be familiar with megawatts here, but basically it's just millions of watts of energy capacity. But what I want you to get the sense of is the scale. A wind turbine outside of Atlantic City is generating 1.5 at its maximum capacity. These future turbines might generate 20 megawatts. A typical turbine that's offshore now might be about 500 feet tall, something like that. The turbines of the future may be more like about, maybe with blade lengths of 7, 8, 900 feet. So we're moving toward really large wind turbines. And the reason for that is that these tend to be much more cost effective, because a lot of the cost of putting in such a large infrastructure offshore is the cost of laying the lines, putting in the towers, the anchors, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't change that much whether you're putting in a very large turbine or a smaller turbine. So if we put in larger turbines, we can have a lot more generation per tower, per anchor point, and therefore get a lot better return on our investment and have less of an impact in general on the region, because there'll be fewer turbines out there. They'll simply be larger turbines. So basically the wind industry, offshore wind industry, is now moving toward larger turbines, and those turbines are significantly sized, but that makes them more cost effective and more efficient.
I read before that the blades are as long as a football field for some, but you're saying that there can be even bigger. That's really puts things into perspective.
Yeah, I think actually one of the 20 megawatt units that's being conceptualized now has blade lengths of about 220 meters, I'm thinking. So what's that, about 700-ish feet?
Wow.
Oh, by the way, that's not blade length, that's blade diameter. So that's from the tip of one blade to the tip of the other blade.
Just shifting gears a little bit to the public response. Offshore wind projects, not only in New Jersey, but all over the East Coast, have run into opposition. In fact, there was just a protest in Ocean City, New Jersey recently to block construction being done as part of Ocean Wind 1, the state's first offshore wind farm.
Mm-hmm.
So communities have concerns about ocean views, marine life, increased energy costs, and so on. Can you speak to any of these concerns? Do you think there are any common misconceptions about offshore wind? And on the flip side of that, are there valid criticisms?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. I think the vast majority of folks that are concerned about offshore wind have good hearts and good intentions. They're concerned about putting large infrastructure offshore, and that's a reasonable concern. And in fact, the wind industry and all of us need to pay attention to do it absolutely right. So wind energy, probably more than any other renewable form, is really dependent basically on proper location. In fact, I consult on some terrestrial wind projects, and I've done some work on offshore wind, but I have far more frequently told interested clients that they should not put up a wind turbine rather than putting up a wind turbine because the location's not right. And that could be because of turbulent wind, it could be because of possible effects on ecology or whatever, but there are reasons where we don't want to necessarily put wind turbines everywhere. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. As I mentioned, offshore is particularly attractive because the wind is basically so predictable and so smooth. On land, realize wind is made turbulent by buildings, trees, mountains, etc. Offshore, we don't have those things, so we don't have to have towers as high, and we get smoother, more predictable airflow. However, that doesn't mean we don't need to be careful. And we do need to do some significant research to make sure that we understand the pattern of bird migrations, the oceanic effects, the effects on species that live on the ocean floor, even the effects on bats, etc. But to be clear, in the case of New Jersey, that research and that hard work has been going on intensively for more than a decade. There have been thousands of transects, basically boats going out, going back and forth, carefully documenting where are the birds, where are the bats at night, where are the sea mammals, how might this affect them, what's the best place to put these wind turbines, how do we lay the cables. Every aspect of this has been carefully designed. And in addition to that, it's important to realize that we know a great deal about this. Now, Folks that are living in the Jersey Shore might be like, look, this is the first time I've heard about this. We don't have any turbines off the Jersey Shore. Do they know what they're doing? My answer is yes, we absolutely know what we're doing because we have done this around the world. There are significant wind farms offshore around the globe, and those have been studied carefully. They've been engineered carefully. So we have a really good, solid sense of how to do this. In fact, the United States is a latecomer in this process. And if there's an advantage to that, it's that we can benefit from the lessons learned by similar wind farms around the world. And look, I have no connections at this point with any company who's doing any offshore wind work anywhere in the United States. But when I see what they're doing, they are absolutely doing it right. They are being very careful. They are paying attention to all the things you want them to pay attention to. They're moving actually slowly, for my money, way too slowly, but in part that's because of some regulatory hurdles they've had to face. So it's being done right. But does that mean that the public should be like, okay, forget about it, it's being done right, I'm good? No, we should absolutely be paying attention and make sure that we are minimizing the effects. However, big picture, the overall environmental impacts of wind turbines are there. After all, you're putting infrastructure offshore. That's going to have some impact. But they are far, far smaller than the alternatives. When you weigh the effects of a wind turbine against the same generation capacity in a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant or a natural gas power plant, the impacts on the global ecosystem and even the impact on local and regional environment is significantly less. So they are indeed a very clean, very ecologically sound form of energy generation. And that, to address climate change and basically the mess we're collectively in, is absolutely necessary. In terms of the opposition, then, I'm sympathetic with the concerns and the diligence of the folks that are saying, look, we need to be careful about this. However, I will point out there's some players in that field that are misrepresenting reality and misrepresenting science. There are some organizations that have an interest in ensuring that wind energy doesn't come to pass, and they have been guilty of basically misinformation of the public. So there are folks who've been intentionally misinformed and now are frightened and believe that wind turbines are far, far, far more damaging to the viewscape or to the ecology than they actually are. The reality is the wind turbines that are being planned in New Jersey will barely be visible, and their overall ecological impact will be absolutely modest at best. And so when there's sort of hype about things like, oh, look at all the beached whales, is this caused by wind turbines? That one in particular is problematic to me because there was these alarm bells raised that, these whales are beaching and this might be caused by wind turbines. But in fact, what people weren't realizing at that time is the number of whales beaching when that whole alarm bell was being rung was no greater than in a typical year. In fact, it was significantly less than several previous years. So basically, we had a public dialogue about, are wind turbines causing the death of whales, when in fact the death of whales was no greater than it had been before any work had been done on the wind turbines, A. B, the actual work that's been done so far could not possibly affect whales because we're basically just at the beginning stages of this. So blaming this on whales is the equivalent of saying, I don't know, your neighbor's dog died and we think it's your air conditioner because you put in your air conditioner the same time your neighbor's dog died, so the two must be connected. But there's no way of sort of making sense of that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming the folks that are concerned about that. Whales are worth saving, absolutely. And if they believe there's a connection, then they should be. I'm all for them raising the alarm bells. But I am concerned about disreputable players that go out there in the public and misrepresent the facts in order to basically get people on their side through misinformation.
Thank you for that and for addressing, those common concerns that we've been hearing about. And that was a great point that you made that, these projects are happening all over the world. So while it might be new to us, they're not new. They are happening elsewhere. Aside from the environmental benefits, the other intended outcome of the offshore wind industry is economic development in the region. What other industries are involved in the offshore wind supply chain?
Right. So as I said, this is a significant infrastructural project. So basically, it has not just the primary players, so the engineers, the manufacturing companies, et cetera, that are making the parts, designing the parts, transporting the parts, all those primary jobs. And I should say that the industry has a real incentive to get as much of the components manufactured locally as possible. And the reason for that has to do with my answer to the first question, which was these things are huge. So if you're building like this massive tower, you really don't want to build a massive tower and then move it thousands of miles. That's very expensive.
Right.
So the blades, for example, are very difficult to move. Basically, what industry does is it manufactures all these components, it moves it on site, and it assembles it on site, right? So they can't be moved very far. So there's a strong incentive to basically create local or regional manufacturing. Obviously, transportation is a big thing. And then think of all the secondary impacts, right? You've got to have the interconnection on land. So now you need some infrastructure construction on land. Even the blue collar jobs, skilled labor, underwater welder, to whatever else, carpenters, et cetera, machinists, et cetera. There's a lot of jobs there. And then the tertiary jobs, or the if you'd like, the jobs that are somewhat separated, which is when you create all these jobs, you also create benefits for other jobs. Like if you're creating more transportation, you're also creating jobs for mechanics that fix the trucks that are going to be necessary for transportation, or the crane operators that are loading these trucks, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at the effect of offshore wind throughout Europe, Scotland, Germany, et cetera, you see that much more than other kinds of infrastructure, it tends to be much more regionally concentrated. That is, the jobs tend to stay in the local area because the parts are so big that it makes sense to do the work as close as possible to where you're putting the turbines.
Yeah, that's certainly an added benefit if it can lead to jobs in the area and further economic development. Bringing it to Stockton, being that Stockton offers degree programs in this area of study, what opportunities do you see for young people as they enter the workforce during this period of energy transition?
Wow. I mean, if I had advice for a young person at this point, and let me give this advice more broadly than just wind energy. Alternative energy is a fantastic career, I think, for two reasons. A, it's super interesting and exciting and changing and dynamic, and it allows you to apply science in cool and interesting ways to new technology. And B, you get to be part of the solution that saves the planet. Basically, you kind of get to be a Marvel superhero as well as in my view, the coolest kind of engineer. So, my students get trained in alternative energy and energy systems and building efficiency, et cetera. And they not only get jobs perhaps in the wind industry, but in the solar industry, or in designing green high performance buildings, or in retrofitting existing buildings for higher performance, renewable energy, et cetera. And all this stuff is growing dramatically. I'm not joking about this. I may be one of the only professors at Stockton who gets calls from engineering firms and companies like in January and February, asking me who's graduating in May and can they interview them. And in part, that's because, unfortunately, the number of students now that are willing to take on the challenge of getting a technical degree, like an engineering degree, has diminished. Fewer students are kind of going to college and deciding that, yep, that's the field I want to get into. I want to be an engineer, or I want to be a scientist. And that's unfortunate, but it's kind of fortunate for the ones that choose to do it, because they've got these jobs waiting for them. And so my students, for example, have awesome jobs. I mean, I'm envious of them. Honestly, they get to go out there and they're like designing these cool new buildings. They're working on these cool projects around the world, whether it's wind, solar, efficient new forms of transportation or whatnot. They're doing cutting edge stuff. They're designing stuff that's never been designed before, making stuff that's never been made before. And they are doing it in order to save all of us. So to me, that's a pretty cool gig.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds promising for these students that are going to be in this industry.
Yeah. And one of the things I like about it, just to kind of add on to that, is it allows you to couple things together in ways that normal engineers can't do. So I have to say, I've got my own share of engineering degrees, but a lot of engineering work by pure engineers, if you'd like, tends to be kind of grueling. They tend to focus on, this is the one thing, and I'm an expert in this kind of metal or this kind of shaping of a part, etc. And that's all I do. But to be an energy engineer, you kind of, and I tell my students this because I believe truly it's the hardest major at Stockton. And the reason it is because they have to know elements of engineering. They have to know elements of science. They have to know how to apply that to systems that haven't been built yet. And I expect them to be experts in public policy, addressing public concerns, economics, even business elements, and ecology. So realize the engineers and the project managers that are, say, working in offshore wind are well aware of ecological impacts and have been trained to think about them and address them. And they are well aware of the policy issues, the regulatory issues, the economic issues involved. So basically, when we train our energy experts, they kind of have to be a jack of all trades and be able to take all these different elements and put it together. Happily for us, that's one of the reasons they have jobs waiting for them when they graduate, is even your classic mechanical engineer from other universities really don't always have those skills, and our kids do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just in our conversation here, we're touching on everything from the economy to the science behind it, the public response. So there's so many different areas that intersect in this industry. And speaking of the policy considerations, that's sort of the next thing that I want to touch on. So many stakeholders are involved when it comes to offshore wind, from state and local authorities to federal regulatory bodies. There are so many parties involved. So what are some regulatory challenges around wind energy production?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, first is just this ridiculous way that climate change and addressing climate change has become a partisan football. So, big picture, it is crazy, insane to me that it has become a Republican versus Democrat debate about whether or not we should make the earth livable into the foreseeable future. To me, this is the equivalent of, like having an invasion from outer space and, whatever, Democrats saying, no, we should surrender to them, and Republicans saying, well, maybe we should fight them. It's like, this is a time for unity. And we are facing that kind of outside threat. And we've been foolish enough to ignore it for way too long. We're now basically behind the eight ball, and we need to find some unity. So one point that I make for my students is that this is not a partisan issue. This is not a right or left issue. This is not a correct or incorrect issue. In fact, and this will connect to my answer in a second, you'll see. But when I first meet my students and I get them, incorporated into the major, one of the things I promise them is if I do my job right, by the time they graduate, they'll be far less certain than they are now about what our way forward is. Because that lack of certainty is what empowers them to find meaningful and real answers. And the reason I'm saying that is because basically the political field now is got this disease of certainty. Republicans are absolutely certain of what the answer is. Democrats are absolutely certain of what the answer is. Environmentalists, some of them will say, absolutely, I am certain that wind turbines are a bad idea. And others say, I'm certain wind turbines are, the answer for the future. And as I said, the answer with offshore wind is it depends. There are places where offshore wind makes sense, and there's places where offshore wind doesn't make sense. It happens that off the shore of New Jersey, it makes a lot of sense because we've got a really good underwater topography. We've got really good wind. So we have ideal conditions really for offshore wind, which is wonderful for the state, the economy of the state, and the global ecology. But there are also places where it won't make sense. And we've got to be willing to take a hard look at those different places and make determinations that are nuanced and that are variable and that are informed by science. And right now, public policy is not very good at that kind of decision making. So big picture, that's a problem. Smaller picture, basically, the industry now is still dominated by the conventional fuel industries, and that makes sense. And as a result of that, The regulators for the industry, the Board of Public Utilities and federal regulators, et cetera, tend to also be dominated and run by folks that cut their teeth in fossil fuels, which makes sense. I'm not criticizing that, because if you are going to be a federal regulator in the energy field, you should know something about energy. And if you're a professional that knows something about energy, you've probably worked in fossil fuels, because that's been our dominant form of energy, or maybe nuclear power or something else. But you've been in a standard and established form of energy. Those folks, by nature, are going to be, let's say, dubious, skeptical of newcomers. And some of them, honestly, will be hostile to newcomers. So, one of the stories that your listeners may be aware of is Fisherman's Energy, which was a wonderful, small offshore wind company that had rallied some investors, built a considerable amount of money, did a lot of ecological energy and wind research, literally for about 7 years, collected data on bats, birds, fish. I helped them collect data on offshore wind, did all their homework, and then could not get approval through the state regulatory process to boot wind turbines in state waters in New Jersey. And basically, if you ask me, the reason for that wasn't like, nefarious backroom dealing. It was that the established regulators in New Jersey were used to fossil fuel industry and brought to the table the expectations and the rules based on the fossil fuel industry, and weren't innovative enough, weren't creative enough to recognize that offshore wind is phenomenal in New Jersey. It's a wonderful opportunity for ratepayers. It's a wonderful opportunity for the citizens of New Jersey and the United States, and we need to take advantage of that. So I guess what I'm saying is, we've got a system that is established to suit the demands of, say, the natural gas industry or the coal industry or others, which is fine because that's what's existed. But we need to be willing to change that system, change the expectations, and adapt to the demands of alternative energy, which has a very different kind of profile.
Now, you sort of already touched on the need for unity as a way forward in this area. And I just want to sort of tie it all together and on closing ask, what is the role of policy? How crucial is policy to the success of offshore wind development and even just decarbonization efforts generally?
Yeah, it's vital. And the reason it's vital is because basically, as just as a historic artifact of having the energy industry dominated by fossil fuels, as I said, the rules, public funding, all of this is sort of, in some way, stacked in favor of the established energy generators. And I'm not being like, this isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. It is natural and normal. Like the natural gas industry, the coal industry, et cetera, have been around for decades. So of course, they helped shape the rules. They helped shape public support. And so newcomers like solar, wind, et cetera, make a lot of economic sense. Long-term, are extremely efficient and have very, very good paybacks. This is absolutely clear to anybody that does the analysis. The dilemma is they've got to break into a system that wasn't built for them. So we've got to be willing to recognize that, look, there is a huge collective public interest in moving toward renewables. We are facing, for goodness sakes, climactic change. We are fundamentally altering the ecological systems of the planet in ways that make the planet less livable. That is a collective interest that we need to address. That's what government is for. Government is not for taking care of your little individual interest here and there. The whole role of government is finding the things that we all share as a common interest and helping us make sure that they're okay. That's why we do things like make murder illegal. That is what government does. So we have found now, we have clearly defined that we are facing a threat. It is the role of government to help us address that threat. And we have a regulatory system and public funding system that favors forms of energy that are not helping us address that threat, which means we need to be willing to change those rules. And we need to be willing to incentivize the startup and the establishment of those industries that are going to help us address this crisis. So to some degree, when folks say, well, look, we shouldn't subsidize the solar industry and the wind industry, that's ridiculous. We subsidize the heck out of the coal industry and the natural gas industry, and the nuclear industry is hugely subsidized by public funds. We need to provide a balance for renewable energy, in particular because renewable energy helps us get out of this threat. When a house is on fire, we do not insist that the fire department make a profit in putting out that house. We actually expect the fire department to protect the public good and address this emergency. Well, we are in a global emergency, and we need to take the steps necessary to address it.
Thank you. Well, I think that is a great note to end on. It really, highlights the big picture of where we are. So thank you so much again for joining us and for sharing your expertise on this topic. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, sure. It's been an absolute pleasure.